You know, Joe Biden started off with a position he wouldn't talk at all, he wouldn't compromise, he was unwilling to consider anything. That was obviously unreasonable, and he had to fold from that because that didn't withstand scrutiny. Where we are now, I don't know if the White House is willing to be reasonable. I'll tell you what I've encouraged President Joe Biden to do, which is listen to Vice President Joe Biden. In 2011, the last big debt ceiling showdown we had, where Republicans held a line and said we need to rein in spending, it was Vice President Joe Biden who negotiated what was called the Budget Control Act, designed to cut $2.3 trillion in spending. And he sat down with Mitch McConnell and with the House Speaker, and they negotiated that deal. I hope Joe Biden as president has at least some modicum of the same willingness to do that. I'm worried that he doesn't have the ability to do it anymore.
Look, I will say honestly, this is going to be a negotiation that plays out. Kevin McCarthy definitely has a stronger hand because he passed the bill in the House. That gives him a stronger negotiating power. He is not going to take something to the floor that he can't get at least a majority of his caucus to sign off on. So hopefully the two of them can work some sort of a deal out. Look, I think we both agree that it's not a good scenario in any way, shape, or form if we default on our debt.
We should absolutely not default on the debt. And I will tell you, I am more worried now that we might default than I ever have been.
Really?
And the reason is I don't think Biden is up to the task. I don't think he's engaged in the negotiations personally and directly. I think
they're talking and sitting and meeting every day.
Yeah, they literally met yesterday. What are you talking about, Ted?
His mental capacities are markedly diminished from even a few years ago.
Senator, don't make me go through this.
And what makes me worry is that I think the decision making in the White House is being done by a bunch of 20-something and 30-something little Marxists who don't have an appreciation for reality.
Oh, I told you I didn't want to dig into this. We're going to get stuck digging into this. I mean,
I will say
the same argument. There have been people who questioned the last president's ability to be able to have rational conversations and do these things. There were people who were talking about having him removed with the 25th Amendment. But look, he's in the room. He's making the talks. Hopefully we get
So I can tell you the reality. All right, when the Senate is in session, every Republican senator, we have lunch together. We sit around and talk about how virtually none of us have spoken to the president even once. He doesn't talk to Republican senators, and that's weird. We all know Joe. I was sworn into office by Vice President Joe Biden. He was a man of the Senate. This White House hides him, and it's unfortunate.
Did McConnell just meet with him?
McConnell had met with him briefly, but it is. I used to talk to Trump every week, sometimes every day. I spoke with Obama. I spoke with Obama regularly. It is weird. Lindsey Graham has flown all over the world with Joe Biden for 20 years. Lindsey hadn't talked with Joe. They keep him hidden. That's not disputed. Like nobody denies that they keep him hidden.
He's not doing media.
He doesn't do media. He doesn't do.
Just sit down with McConnell, and McCarthy is talking to him every day.
He also just went to the G7. It's not like this guy is hiding.
Hold on a second.
I don't want to be in the. I don't want to be in the corner of defending
He's intellectually acute and on things. Great. If he is, then he ought to do what he did in 2011. I don't think he is, and I'm worried because I think the young extreme staffers in the White House have no appreciation for just how damaging a default would be. And so I think they are quite willing to force a default because they think the media will blame it on Republicans. And I think that would be wildly irresponsible.
The talking points I hear all the time is that this would be much worse for the president to go into a default because he's the president who would get blamed in the next election cycle, which is why Donald Trump is urging anyone in the House to say no. Don't do this. Vote against it.
I don't think that's what the White House believes. I think the White House believes whatever happens, the media will blame it on Republicans. Whether that's true or not, I think that's what the White House believes. And one thing to be clear, Joe Biden today could take the chances of a default to zero. Here's what I think a responsible president would say. He would stand up and say, under no circumstances will we ever, ever, ever default on the debt, no matter what. The United States honors our commitments. Now, how could he do that?
He could do that by claiming the 14th Amendment and say he's going to pay out. And I know you
except that would be patently unconstitutional. But he could do it in a very simple way that is clearly legal, which is that every month federal tax revenues coming into the federal government significantly exceed interest on the debt. And he could say, we're going to pay interest on the debt. We're not going to default.
We're not going to pay everything else.
That's what's called prioritization. Right. He could do that.
And they very well may get to that situation at the beginning.
They may get to that situation, but the reason that he hasn't said that, which he could say, he could take the chances of default to zero. The reason he hasn't is I think the White House is trying to scaremonger on this. They're trying to threaten default.
Well, not paying the rest of our bills would not be great either.
Well, but
do you
let's
stop paying the veterans? Do you stop paying the Defense Department? Do you stop paying the salaries of people in Congress?
Okay, not paying the salaries of people in Congress would actually be a pretty good step. So
those should be the first bills they don't pay, actually.
To be clear, everyone agrees that the debt ceiling needs to be raised. But if you look historically, it has been the only leverage that has been effective in reining in out of control spending.
Look, it's a negotiating tool. I get it.
And it's the only thing that works. And given Squawk Bucks gets into the numbers, I think it's worth pausing for a second and reflecting at how different this is from the past. So 2017, total federal spending was about $4 trillion. Total federal tax revenue was about $3.3 trillion. Now, quick math, that means we had about a $700 billion deficit. That was 2017. Fast forward to today. Total spending has gone from $4 trillion up to $6.5 trillion, $6.4 trillion. Tax revenues have exploded. Tax revenues have gone from $3.3 trillion to $4.8 trillion. Now, quick pause to note, when we signed the 2017 tax cuts that I fought very hard to pass, every Democrat went on TV and said this is going to slash federal revenues and blow up the deficit. Turns out they were entirely wrong on that. Every year, federal tax revenues have gone up, and they've gone up from $3.3 trillion to $4.8 trillion. The problem isn't tax revenues. The problem is we had a spending binge from the Democrats that has caused the national debt to go from 20 trillion rather to 32 trillion in 4 years.
We did pass an infrastructure bill, a CHIPS bill, the ridiculously named Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, look, I voted against those bills. Those were mistakes.
You voted against the infrastructure bill too?
Yes.
Okay, so there are people who would say even once we get through that, you got to cut the spending back because those are long-term projects that maybe even if they were in need of spending.
And by the way, if the infrastructure bill had focused on actual roads and bridges and infrastructure that we need, I would have happily voted for it. The problem was it was filled with all sorts of goodies for special interest that had nothing to do with real infrastructure.
So you said it, Squawk Box is all about the numbers,
Yep.
so is CNBC. So the S&P 500 is at 4,200. There seems to be a firm belief in the markets that a deal will be reached. It sounds like you're saying to market participants, brace yourself because we could actually go to default. That's a scenario that we are not pricing into the markets right now.
I agree. And listen, I think a deal will be reached. I think at the end of the day.
So even though you're saying Joe Biden's not going to be the vice president of 2011, you think a deal is going to be reached?
I think a deal will be reached, but I worry that the chances of a default are greater than they ever have been. I worry that this White House is reckless enough to force a default. I don't think that'll happen. I think that's less likely than not, but the odds are higher than we should be happy with.
Let's switch to technology. We were just having
Well, the discussion about what happened, yes.
We'll respond to some of these things as well in just a moment.
Sure, of the Pentagon being bombed. What else can you imagine under this scenario? How do you stop it? How do you make sure that this is not going to be something that we have to be worried about every day?
Oh, look, it's a brave new world we're in, and it is frightening between technology, the technology of deep fakes, between where AI is going. It's just going to be a very dangerous environment for the foreseeable future. And we're going to have real skepticism to almost anything you see to make sure it is real and accurate. It's not going to be that hard to suddenly have video of some politician saying something they never said, or somebody, people doing things that never happened. And so it's going to be incumbent on, it's actually why I'm a big believer in free speech, that if you have lots of people engaged, you can have real-time fact-checking. You remember one of the first big instances of this was Dan Rather back in, I guess it was 2004, where he had 60 Minutes, this big expose on George W. Bush with these documents. And, it's one of the first instances of, I guess it was a bunch of, bloggers in their pajamas who noticed the documents that he claimed to have appeared to be fraudulent. And it ended up within a couple of days revealing that they were fake and fraudulent documents. That was one of the first real illustrations to me of the power of the community of folks online being able to point to facts and correct them. And with new technology, we're going to need to do that.
It's easier to do that when you have a limited number of news sources and a bunch of people fact checking them, when everybody is a news service, which is essentially what you have on a lot of these social media apps. That becomes, it's how something can get faked and spread instantaneously, and before you have the time to fact check it. The stock drops significantly.
Yeah, awesome.
There's questions about security, something along those lines.
And I'd say yes and no. I worry about what has happened to much of the media. There's a reason I like coming on Squawk Box, because y'all actually talk about substance and you get into it, and you guys are much, much less partisan than most of the other media outlets out there. One of the really unfortunate consequences, I think, of the age of Trump is that much of the media, Trump broke the media. That stations like CNN, MSNBC, they hate Trump so much that they've stopped practicing journalism. And I don't think that's good for America when people who are supposed to be journalists view their role as advocates pushing a point of view. Particularly in that context, I think it's important to have lots and lots of people where everyone can be a publisher and can press back.
So the media is broken, but back to the question, is there anything Congress can do about AI? Because misinformation can spread, and it's like shouting fire in a crowded movie theater. And in this case, it could be billions of dollars in market cap shaved off the stock market, a single stock. So many different ramifications here.
Well, it's not like Congress is going to be able to wave a magic wand and make AI go away. It's not like Congress is going to be able to stop criminal activity and make suddenly criminals go away either.
No, but you signed off on an amicus brief against Section 230, and I think that's a good start.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, Section 230 was passed at a time when the internet barely existed, and it was designed to protect a nascent industry and to enable it to grow. We now have big tech are these massive behemoths, the largest companies in the world, and the power they exercise, the monopoly control they exercise, and in particular 230, when it was passed, Congress assumed that big tech would be a neutral public square. In other words, it wouldn't be putting its thumb on the scale, it wouldn't be silencing some voices and not others, but it would let everyone speak. And the reasoning was, it's not fair to sue Facebook because of a comment you make or I make, because if you make it or I make it, it's not Facebook's fault. Now that's true if they're an open public square for everyone. What's happened is that big tech in recent years has decided to actively and aggressively censor speech and silence views they disagree with. And I got to say, Elon Musk's buying Twitter and making the Twitter files public was an absolute game changer.
If that is your view, though, about big tech and their ability to control speech, et cetera, then that should be even more of a concern when it comes to AI.
Yes.
They are the leaders in AI right now. They're the ones that have accrued billions of dollars in market cap because of the notion that they are in the lead on AI.
Yeah.
So is that a much bigger concern? And how does it factor in also? Because there's a thinking that if you constrain the development of AI in this country, that you're going to actually allow other countries, particularly China, to take the lead in this technology.
Look, I think you make a very good point, and I am quite nervous about constraining the development of AI. And are there very real dangers coming from AI across the board? Yes. I chaired the very first congressional hearing ever on artificial intelligence. The problem is, and is there a need for congressional action on some point? Almost surely there is. But the problem is most people in Congress don't understand this at all. Look, we don't do intelligence very well, much less artificial intelligence. And, you know, the Senate, I think the median age is about 142. You know, one of my colleagues on Judiciary referred to the internet as a system of tubes. We should be careful asking folks who don't really understand it to regulate it. I think Congress needs to get smarter. I think we need to have hearings. I think we need to consider testimony, but I think we should proceed slowly so that we don't go in and break things. The last thing I want is for China to get way, way ahead of us on AI because government regulators have gotten in the way. So it is reasonable to be worried about where AI is taking us, but I don't think Congress is going to fix the problem overnight.
Senator Cruz, want to thank you for coming in today.
Always a pleasure.
Good to see you.
This was actually surprisingly a really good piece. Like, that's one of the reasons I like this 5 to 6 o'clock hour, even though this began a little bit before that with CNBC, is they have really good guests on around this time. and it really better than what you see closer to bell time on CNBC or earlier in the morning. Just my take, Anyway, so I'll go backwards here a little bit and just address a few things. First of all, a lot of people are talking about investing in Chinese AI. I actually think there's a reason to be cautious about that, specifically because with Chinese AI, you're running into severe risks of US sanctions basically destroying Chinese AI companies. I know that sounds extreme, like how could America destroy a company? Oh, they can. Even just limiting China's access to some of the most powerful or advanced microchips could sandbag some intelligence race. And I think that's probably exactly why America is sanctioning China's ability to get their hands on advanced lithography machines to make smaller transistors, or reduce the spacing between them down to that 5 to 3 nanometer level or below that. Mostly because one of the best weapons we have is just having better chips than China. I still refer to China as the teenager of the global stage, where China's kind of coming into its discovery of its sort of like power, like, I'm a big, I went to the zoo last week. I went to San Diego with my kids, Lauren and I, and they're teaching the kids about the gorillas, and it's kind of like the gorilla teenagers. They get really aggressive because they're just coming to realize how strong they are, but they don't know what they're doing, so they're constantly like hurting themselves and stumbling over each other, and they have to kind of like realize how strong they are. And to some extent, it maybe a little bit feels like China is kind of like that. And so personally, I can't invest in China because I don't understand, like it's a totally different culture. So I don't understand how to even analyze what companies would do well with Chinese consumers. So this is why I've always stayed away from China. But also I think that the United States and Europe will probably make it their mission to continue to sort of keep a boot on the neck, or maybe more appropriate, like keep the gorilla of China caged a little bit, basically limit their ability to really explode with artificial intelligence relative to what I think American companies will be able to do. Keep in mind as well, just sort of on the topic of China, Joe Biden's suggested potentially some softening relations coming with China. I really believe this is because they have to. China's GDP is coming in or is expected to come in substantially lower than what they've been growing at the last 2 decades. They've been growing at somewhere around 8.9%. Now their GDP will grow somewhere around 5%. And they're trying to stimulate their economy to grow more because they want that growth. The United States has way more partnerships around the world than China does, and they're potentially way stronger. I mean, think about American alliances are not just trade partnerships, but they're defense partnerships. Sure, China's got their Belt Road Initiative, and they've got some friends in Pakistan and North Korea and maybe Iran now after their negotiations with the Saudis. But I mean, when you look at, and then maybe you could say Russia, but I mean, what kind of friend is that? I mean, that's the loose cannon friend. You're like, just leave us alone, but maybe settle down. China really ought to condemn Russia. But I don't want to go super super deep on China, but really, if you think about it, it's tough. It's tough to argue that investing in Chinese chips or AI is the best move when the international community is going to do everything they can to limit Chinese growth. Now, then you wonder, okay, well, how much of that is already priced in? I don't know. You have to figure that one out. But then again, trying to underwrite Chinese stocks with their public filings relative to what we have. And I'm not saying that companies with public filings over here are not shysters. There are plenty of reasons to think that companies with public filings are shysters. Just look at, not to mention any names, possible. But yeah, so going back to Ted Cruz's argument, I'm not terribly worried about Chinese AI as an individual, mostly because I actually think that Congress We'll give them credit there, and the international community will already cage in China. So that leaves me less worried about that. And it will be interesting to see how regulation evolves for AI here, but that'll all come in time, probably too late, as it usually does. There's already research now that AI is getting more attention than Bitcoin has been getting over the past 3 to 4 to 5 years. I find it very interesting because the stock market's been trending up, but Bitcoin really has. I mean, Bitcoin had a really nice run there. So yeah, we're at 27.3 right now. So it's done very well because it's nearly doubled, right? I mean, we're at 15 something. So maybe it's just on its natural break, so to speak. You go to the 1 year, yeah, we're about at the same level as the 1 year on BTC right now. But at the start of the year, we were at 16.9. So I guess Bitcoin's doing just fine because if you think about it, it's outperformed the other indices. 16.9, yeah, it's up 61%. It's way outperformed. It's basically performed like a tech stock. Not the NASDAQ, though. NASDAQ's only up like 27%. But anyway, this debt ceiling, just to sort of finish that, it's interesting that Ted Cruz argues that Joe Biden should come out and declare that America will not default. And this is what I just so much hate about politics. It's literally what Joe Biden has done. And I'm not here to like shill a party or Joe Biden or whatever, but of course, if you're Joe Biden, you're like, we will not default. And then the Republicans are like, man, if only Joe Biden would come out and say we will not default. It's gotta suck being the president because you're just like, dude, I literally just said that. Man, if only he would just say it. It's like, but I think that Ted is, the talk was good, but I think there's a little bit of extremeness in this idea that, the quote unquote 20-year-olds in the White House are willing to let the government default. I'm not that skeptical. Do I think that Joe Biden is at 100% in that mental capacity department? No. But I do I think that like somehow woke leftists, 20-year-old staffers are running the White House? I mean, hopefully not. I mean, nobody knows, but I don't think that would lead to a default. I think that's a really weak argument to say that, oh yeah, woke leftists who are 20 years old are gonna be willing to gamble our entire economy on this debt ceiling negotiation. It doesn't sound like the negotiations are going that badly. And this is why, earlier we started on the debt ceiling. I'm like, this is just so annoying. But really, I mean, every day it's like, you'll get Republicans walked out. And then like a day later, things are better. Or like Kevin McCarthy on Sunday, Joe Biden should be here instead of at the G7. And it's like, dude, the presidents are always at the G7 meeting. The United States president has never missed a meeting of the G7. Because if they did, it would be G6. Okay, well, has there ever been a G6? No. So the United States president has never missed that meeting. And then over the weekend, you get Kevin McCarthy, well, Joe Biden should be here instead of over there. It's like, that's a popular thing to say, but like, you can't all of a sudden stop the global calendar of events, because you want to sit down and duke things out. And then sure enough, they end up sitting down and had progressive talks. So I don't know. I think Becky Quick really held a good discussion here with Ted. I obviously it's a lot of it's party talk, but none of this was particularly scary. And I don't know what to say other than that. not scared. Maybe gain the lead. Are we able to say that though? Because I feel like the stock market is slightly ticking into red today after yesterday's rally. But then again, you would kind of expect a little bit of a give back. So that's pretty typical. Now, I want you to know this: when it comes to AI, time is what's going to make you money. And if you can prove that value to an employer, you'll always be able to be employed. So this is another way of making sure that you don't get replaced